The views and opinions expressed on America's Workforce Union podcast and its digital media channels are solely those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of the producers or sponsors.
Welcome to the America's Workforce Radio Podcast, the flagship production of the American Workers Radio and Podcast Network, where organized labor and its never-ending fight to protect the rights of the American worker come first. Now, presented by LIUNA, Laborers International Union of North America. Here's your host, Ed Flash Ferens.
What a company union did to workers at a Mexican mine, and how the Rapid Response Labor Team came to their rescue. The economic cost of ICE in one state. And today on the show, the Communication Workers of America and the question, can workers really have free speech rights? Welcome to the Wednesday, April 15th edition of America's Workforce, where we're available on at least 5 platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. A lot of different ways you can access America's Workforce, and we thank you for that. We have 2 guests on the show today. We're going to kick things off with Frank Mathews, longtime supporter of America's Workforce. Frank is the Administrative Director for District 4, the CWA. That encompasses all of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And we're primarily going to talk about politics. There was a state Supreme Court in Wisconsin that went to the Democratic side last week. We'll touch on that. We'll also focus on the state of Ohio, some key races for Congress in Northeast and Central Ohio, and one in Indiana. So Frank will be our first guest. Then we're going to go to Andrew Strom, our designated labor lawyer who currently serves as an adjunct professor at the Brooklyn Law School. And he did a post on the Harvard Law School labor blog. And I reference this every day. I encourage you to do the same, because there's a lot of good reporting there by the students going to Harvard. And this one is titled, Can Workers Have Free Speech Rights? And this all comes after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. A lot of people spoke out about it, and they criticized Kirk, and they were fired from their jobs. At least 600 instances of individuals who were punished for criticizing Charlie Kirk after he was killed. Andrew points out that free speech, well, it's really not free speech, especially if you're not in a union. And we're going to focus that. You may recall the story about the Ford worker when Trump was visiting a plant in Michigan several months ago. He spoke out and was disciplined. Well, the union got his job back. Now, if you're not in a union, you're pretty much an at-will employee. You are at the will of your employer, which means the employer can say, you know what? You don't have a job anymore. All right. We just don't like the way you're performing here on the job, and we're going to let you go. And that's it. That's it. With the union, it's a totally different story. He's also going to reference a book that came out some years ago by Elizabeth Anderson, who's a University of Michigan professor. She wrote a book called Private Government with the subtitle, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. And it addresses how we take for granted the authoritarian control that employers hold over workers. But the question is, does it have to be that way? onlabor.org, onlabor.org, to read that article by Andrew Strom. Now, a brief look into the world of labor. The segment brought to you by Boyd Watterson Asset Management. You can find more at boydwatterson.com. The Rapid Response Labor Mechanism, created under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, often called NAFTA 2.0, has found that workers at the Camino Rojo mine in Mexico were denied their labor rights in a report made public 2 weeks ago. Now, according to the panel, Camino Rojo interfered with workers' rights by pushing the mine's preferred union. It was a company union called Minas over the workers' then incumbent union, Los Mineros, and by engaging in coercion, physical violence, and psychological intimidation, including threats of dismissal. Representatives of Los Mineros celebrated the ruling and discussed their violations on a recent podcast called La Voz Minera. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm doing my best here. One of the hosts stated that Minas even broke into their homes to make threats and to tell them to forget about their union. In this case, Mexico lost, but its workers won. The panel recommended remedies, including a public apology, a commitment by management to respect freedom of association, and promote workers' rights, reinstatement of compensation for affected workers, and additional security measures for union representatives accessing that mine. So congratulations here to the rapid response team. And I got to do a shout out here to the steel workers, because when those negotiations occurred back in, I believe it was 2018, 2019, they made it a point that, the unions in Mexico are not really unions. They're company unions. They're very vocal about that. And I might add that USMCA will be renegotiated this summer. We talked about that on the show some months back. The surge in activity by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, in late January likely cost local economies millions of dollars in lost economic activity. And I got to thank the Maine Center for Economic Policy for this story. During what they called Operation Catch of the Day, which was conducted between January 20th and the 29th in the state of Maine, mass federal agents arrested large numbers of people in seemingly arbitrary ways, creating an atmosphere of fear which led people to stay home from school, work, and shopping. Well, the result was a decrease in everyday economic activity, an unknown number of people in Maine placed at risk of going hungry or being evicted from their homes, and the psychological and social harms that translate into measurable economic losses. So what number are we talking about? Well, the center estimates the operation actually reduced taxable retail sales by $3.4 million, and that's over a 10-day period, in the areas most directly affected. This represents a decline in sales of just over 2% in various regions. And in those areas, the Maine Center for Economic Policy also estimates an average of over 2,300 people. 2,300 people were absent from work every day, and more than 1,000 students were absent from school. They point out continued arrests and potential deportations could shrink Maine's workforce and economic output, with the removal of roughly 157 workers, potentially reducing the state's economy by nearly $12 million a year. That's just one state. Just one state. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Frank Mathews on behalf of the Communication Workers of America. Once again, you're listening to America's Workforce.
You're listening to America's Workforce with Ed Flash Ferens.
It takes LiUNA to power North America with affordable energy. The men and women of LiUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, have the skills needed to build and maintain oil, natural gas, nuclear, solar, and wind projects that are shaping America's energy future. From new energy tech to retrofitted facilities, LiUNA members do it all. Find out what it takes to be powered by LiUNA at liuna.org. That's liuna.org.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Communication Workers of America. You can find more at cwa-union.org.
Now, back to America's Workforce. Here's Ed Flash Ferens.
And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast. Let's go to our first guest today, Frank Mathews, longtime supporter of America's Workforce on behalf of the Communication Workers of America. National website you want to go to, cwa-union.org. And Frank is the administrative director for District 4, which includes all of Ohio, all of Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois. Frank, I know you want to talk about politics today. Early voting has started in Ohio and a number of states, but last week, I'm sure there's some happy campers with your members in the state of Wisconsin. There was a state Supreme Court race, And you think about what happened because in 2010, we saw a lot of states move to the right, especially in the Midwest. Wisconsin was one of them. It seems like it's starting to unwind there. Talk to me about the ground game over there, Frank. Go ahead, brother.
Well, unwind's a great term. You mentioned 2010. I was actually a staff rep, and I covered Wisconsin in 2010. I remember being up there the night that Governor Walker, in the middle of the night, passed that bill outlawing public sector unions. So it seemed to go through a spell for about 10 years after that, to where working families were targeted up there, and systematically over the last decade and a half or better, working families have been saying enough's enough. And I think right now it's a 5-2 margin of, those are nonpartisan seats, but we know who puts workers first and who puts billionaires and CEOs first. And fortunately, Judge Chris Taylor was elected. It was a huge turnout, which I think speaks volumes. We, as we always do, we educate our members. We let them know first and foremost how they vote's their own position, but we want working families voting. And I think it's pretty obvious there was huge turnout up there. The previous Supreme Court race had a huge turnout, driven by the fact that Elon Musk had showed up with a chainsaw on stage saying it was time to take back Wisconsin, and it actually backfired. So this time, the numbers were bigger on turnout, and the folks like Elon stayed away, thinking that would help that candidate. So it was very telling, I think, that working families and working folks are tired of what's going on. We're tired of the fuel prices, the grocery prices, anytime something needs cut, the things like Social Security and unemployment and insurance being the first on the spit, the millionaires and billionaires don't seem to have any skin in the game. So, and I think what's very interesting, and I know we wanted to talk about some other stuff, but there's another very conservative, very anti-labor Supreme Court justice up in that state that has announced they're going to retire next year. So, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that because of the 5-2 margin on that Supreme Court up there, that probably working families are protected to a degree for another at least 10 years in that state, which is phenomenal. So hopefully next year we can make it a 6 out of 7.
There you go. There you go. Well, we'll see if some of that transfers over to the state of Ohio. I know you've been monitoring what's going on. Again, it's boots on the ground. Talk to me about the races that are really, really gaining a lot of attention in the state of Ohio.
Right. We're in primary time here. We're actually in early voting in Ohio, and in most of our states, we have early voting going on right now. We have an election on May 5th here in the state. Most of the time during primaries, you may have one race in the state that's very interesting, and then you get going in the general. All across the district, we've got several races that we are actively looking at in the primary process here in Ohio. Of course, we have Brian Poindexter in the Cleveland area that's running for Congress. Brian is running in the Ohio 7th Congressional District in a primary that has quite a few people in it, but our members are very excited over Brian. So often, we really say as labor leaders and as union members that how nice it would be to have somebody that kind of looks like us, that lives like us, that maybe lives paycheck to paycheck and is out here struggling as a working person, actually in DC. And we're going to have that chance with Brian. Brian is a union iron worker. So often through this, we'll say, let's show us what a person's done. What kind of leader have they been? Not that they just want to be in DC, that, hey, I have an ego so big I can do that. But Brian's actually walked the walk. He's been a Brook Park City Council member, which is how CWA really got to know Brian. He brings a real lived experience and strong commitment to public service and working families to our area. So we're really anxious. We've been doing some phone banking and some texting to our members in that area. We'll be reaching out to them another way and saying, "Hey, this is somebody that working families need to vote to get behind, so we can change that district and get some leadership in that congressional district that worries about working families, worries about those folks living day to day and living paycheck to paycheck and the sort." And I think we really have that chance with Brian. We've got a person down in the Columbus area, the 15th congressional district, named Adam Miller, that's running for Congress down there. He's another one that we have supported in the past. He brings some real life experience. He's been a state rep for a while. Adam started out on the Grandview Heights School Board. He's a Army veteran in the reserves right now, I believe. Yeah, he's a JAG in the Army JAG Corps Reserve. Combat veteran, multiple overseas tours. He lives the life and the normal life that our members live. Those are the type of people that we want in these offices. So, those are a couple of them. We've got Andre Carson, who's running to be reelected over in Indiana. He's been a great friend of working people in the Indianapolis area. We've been working hard and educating our members on that primary over there. Up in Wisconsin, over in the Eau Claire area, we've got a candidate named Jessica Cook that is a CWA endorsed regular working person that wants to get in there to represent, working families and doesn't put billionaires and CEOs first. So it's an exciting time in the primary, and we need to get these folks through the primary so then they can take on the status quo in their elections. So we've been working on things like making sure our members are registered. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that if they hadn't voted in the last couple primaries or an election or so, the Secretary of State in Ohio has been really good at or really bad, I should say, at trying to drop people from the voter polls. So we're encouraging folks to reach out to the Secretary of State's office and then go online at www.ohiosos.gov/elections, or if they just get to that www.ohiosos.gov and check their voting status to make sure that they are registered. And that's the thing. Nobody wants to show up on election day or show up to early vote and be told that, well, we don't show you as being registered. Folks will have, now that the early vote time has started, folks will have until, I believe, October 3rd to register for the general in November. So in addition to educating our members, we're really cognizant of the fact that we want our members to check their voting status, to make sure they're registered to vote. And no matter how they vote, that's their business. We don't tell people how to vote. The important thing is working families, we should be voting, Flash.
Yeah, and that's exactly what unions do. So the focus now, obviously, is on the primaries.
Right.
What I want to do, and maybe we could save this for the next time, we can dissect what happened in early May in the state of Ohio and the various states in the Midwest that you represent. What my concern is, Frank, and I'm sure it's your concern as well, the amount of money that's going to be poured into this election. I mean, alone, just in the governor's race, I see already $10 million in the state of Ohio, and it's only going to amplify. We got a hotly contested Senate race. Sherrod Brown is trying to make a comeback. So I'm sure we'll have a lot more to cover in the next conversation here on America's Workforce. But let's hope for the best in the primaries. You take care, and we'll talk to you next month, okay?
All right. You take care, Flash.
Frank Mathews on behalf of the Communication Workers of America. The national website, by the way, is cwa-union.org. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Andrew Strom, our designated labor lawyer, will be joining us and talking about free speech. Is it really free? his story right after this on America's Workforce.
This is America's Workforce. More shows available at awfradio.com.
There is unity and strength for workers.
We are the USW.
We are the USW,
the United Steelworkers.
The largest industrial union in North America.
We represent 850,000 members in the U.S., Canada, and the Caribbean.
We work in metals,
rubber,
chemicals,
paper,
oil refining,
atomic energy, and the service sector.
We are steelworkers, standing strong and fighting for what's right.
This segment of the show is brought to you by the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. For more information, please visit bmwe.org.
Now, back to Ed Flash Ferens with America's Workforce.
And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. You know, in the last couple of decades, more and more people have become vocal, very vocal. A lot of that has to do with the political divide in America, but you have to be very careful with what you say. A lot of people lost their jobs because of what they said following the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Well, joining us on our live line right now is Andrew Strom. Andrew is our designated labor lawyer. He's also adjunct professor at the Brooklyn Law School, and his blog, which is posted on the website onlabor.org. I reference that every day, onlabor.org. Can workers have free speech rights? Well, we know one thing. If you're in a union, you got a lot more protections. Andrew, welcome back to America's Workforce, and thank you for putting this together. I'm going to turn it over to you because there's a lot of people that probably want to say something, but don't. Why don't you just pick it up from there?
Absolutely. I mean, Reuters compiled 600 cases of workers who were punished for their comments related to Charlie Kirk, after he was assassinated. I thought of this again, when, of course, the president, after Robert Mueller died, posts, "Good, I'm glad he's dead," which is exactly the kind of thing that could get a regular worker fired. There's a great book out there. There's a professor, University of Michigan, named Elizabeth Anderson, and she wrote a book years ago called Private Government: How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. I think it's really outrageous. We don't talk about it, how, we think of ourselves, in this country, everybody prizes their free speech rights. People talk about the First Amendment all the time, but the First Amendment doesn't apply at workplaces. If you're a government employee, it does apply. So if you're a government employee, you have free speech rights. If you work for a private employer, it's not just things you post on the internet. It's maybe you show up at a No Kings rally, maybe you go to an anti-ICE protest, or even just you have a conversation with your coworkers where you express an opinion that your boss doesn't like. Any of those things can get you fired. There was a Supreme Court case in 1981 when Ronald Reagan was shot. Someone tried to assassinate him when he was president. This young clerical worker who worked at a Texas law enforcement agency said to a coworker, "If they go for him again, I hope they get him." And she was fired for saying that, and somehow took her case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said she had a First Amendment right to say that. What the Supreme Court said was, they said that vigilance, this is a quote from the case, "Vigilance is necessary to ensure that public employers do not use authority over employees to silence discourse, not because it hampers public functions, but simply because superiors disagree with the content of employee speech." I think that's so important, that, we live in this world where people need to be able to speak out. It's not that you can say anything you want anytime. If you have a captive audience, right, your coworker doesn't want to hear you ranting about whatever your political views are, or you're, using, racial slurs or other kinds of slurs. I mean, those kind of things can be limited. But if people are just expressing their opinions, and, and sometimes one of the points I've made is that, when people are speaking, we're so used to politicians, who have speech writers and, or people writing professionally who have editors. But a lot of times, rank and file workers, when they're speaking, they don't have an editor, they don't have a speechwriter. So sometimes they say things that are maybe not, if they had the chance to say it again, maybe they would say it a little bit more carefully. Like I'm thinking about this case, right? This McPherson case, the case that I was just talking about. Basically, what she meant was she thought the country would be better off with a different president. Not that she was encouraging someone to go out and shoot the president, but that's what she meant. And that's, I think, really the problem is sometimes people say things that, especially in this day and age, with the internet, people say things that, too quickly and too easily, that they probably should sit on their thought for an hour before they hit send.
Right. Well, you point out in your article that McPherson, this is the case that went to the Supreme Court in 1981, they were made privately to a coworker. Yeah,
exactly.
Privately to a coworker. Now, I have to ask you this. If that came up today, I mean, there was no social media back then. How would the court rule on something like that today, in your opinion?
The thing about the social media is, right, then you start to get into these other factors. And those cases come up actually, in the government context, right, where the government can say that, like, oh, if people make those kinds of statements, it can discredit the office, right? But the government has an interest in having all citizens feel like they're the government of all the citizens, right? So
right.
You don't want to have a situation where you feel like every civil servant is highly partisan. But those are balancing tests, right? That they have to do, right? That you have to figure out, is the random speech of one individual really going to undermine the government, people's trust in the government? And I think one of the things that, one of the points that I made in the piece is, I think this is true for big companies. It's true for the government, that the public should welcome the idea that people have diverse points of view, right? In other words, that you're not going to, expect that, because people sometimes will be like calling for, like with the Charlie Kirk comments that people made, we should boycott that company because, one worker at a Starbucks said something. Starbucks have tens of thousands of workers. You would hope that they don't all think exactly alike. You would hope that, in a government office, that you would have a range of viewpoints. And the idea that one individual, particularly, a low-level worker, can express an opinion, that maybe is an unpopular opinion, or maybe is a controversial opinion. I mean, that shouldn't be a grounds for getting people fired. And I think it's particularly true, when we think about Donald Trump, right? I mean, the president has a bigger megaphone than anyone else in this country, right? So the president can say whatever he wants about any topic at any time, and everybody's paying attention to what he says, right? The only way to counter that is to have, regular people be able to express their own opinion and say, you know what, I don't agree with the president. The president's wrong about this. We so prize free speech, but free speech doesn't mean anything if you can lose your job for expressing your First Amendment rights.
Yeah.
And this should be really a nonpartisan or bipartisan issue, right? I mean, this shouldn't be a controversial notion that workers should have free speech rights on the job. Nobody wants to live in a country where, you can't express yourself because, you can lose your job if you say the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our forefathers were pretty specific about that. Andrew, I got to take a quick break here. We're speaking with Andrew Strom, who's an adjunct professor. He's our designated labor law expert here on America's Workforce. Do check out the website onlabor.org. The article is, Can Workers Have Free Speech Rights? It's a little bit different when you're in a union. We'll talk about that next right here on America's Workforce. Don't go away.
This is America's Workforce. More shows available at awfradio.com.
American workers are sick of struggling to get by. It's time to get ahead. In the Teamsters Union, workers are winning industry-leading contracts, historically high wages, fully paid health care, and retirement benefits you can count on. Across the country, Teamsters fight alongside our brothers and sisters to secure a better life. It's what we've been doing and how we've been living for more than a century. When we fight, we win. Join us. Be a Teamster.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Heat and Frost Insulators Labor Management Cooperative Trust. Find out more at insulators.org/LMCT.
America's Workforce is sponsored in part by Boyd Watterson Asset Management, LLC. Find out more about our investment solutions tailored to meet the needs of Taft-Hartley funds at boydwatterson.com.
Now, back to Ed Flash Ferens with America's Workforce.
And remember, you could check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. Always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. Let's go back to Andrew Strom talking about free speech rights. The article is Can Workers Have Free Speech Rights? This is posted on the website onlabor.org. This is a service of the Harvard Law School, onlabor.org. We're talking about a lot of people. I see you quoted about 600 instances of individuals who were punished because they spoke out about the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which happened a couple of months ago. Now, at will versus a union contract, there's a lot. The majority of American workers are at will employees, and you point that out in your article, which means you are at the will of the boss. Boss can say, I don't like what you're doing. You're out of here. Now, when you got a union contract, different story. I want to talk about, you recall the worker at Ford. This was in Michigan a couple of months ago when Donald Trump showed up at the plant. He said a few things and they suspended him. What's the story on that one? And this shows the difference here with the union contract.
My understanding is that the union filed a grievance. The result was that he got reinstated with back pay. And that's the benefit of having a union contract, because union contracts typically say you can only be fired or disciplined for just cause. Just cause is not you say something that your supervisor doesn't like, right? Just cause, it has to be something that interferes, with the functioning of the workplace in some way. But it's not just a question of the boss doesn't like what you say. And so, if you have a union contract, you definitely have a lot more rights on the job to express yourself and to let your opinion be heard.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it should be.
Yeah. Andrew, some states are a little more progressive than other states when it comes to free speech rights. I see you cited Connecticut. What happened in Connecticut, Andrew?
So this is something where a number of states have passed laws giving varying levels of protection to workers for their free speech rights. And one of the strongest of those state laws is the state of Connecticut. And the state of Connecticut says that employers can't discharge employees for exercising their First Amendment rights, provided, quote, such activity does not substantially or materially interfere with the employee's bona fide job performance or the working relationship between the employee and the employer. I mean, unfortunately, there's a really not a great Connecticut Supreme Court case on this, where an employer directed all the workers to display American flags at their workstations, and one worker objected, and he was fired. The court said that he didn't state a First Amendment claim because there was no danger that the flag's message would be attributed to him personally, so that his speech wasn't a matter of public concern. But, even though I think that decision was wrong, I think the more important part of that decision is that if he had spoken about something that was a matter of public concern, his job would be protected. That's just an example. There's, a few other states like Connecticut have some form of free speech protections for workers. And, in those states, the sky hasn't fallen. It's not something that, and we see that, as I started out by saying, when public sector employees have these rights, if you ask people on the street, should private sector workers have fewer free speech rights than public sector workers? I don't think anyone would say that makes sense.
Right.
People might think the opposite, frankly, but they wouldn't think, if you work for a private company, somehow you should have lesser free speech rights. To me, it's just a matter of common sense. But it's also, I guess, a question of who controls Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
No, I hear you. Well, the bottom line, the takeaway, if you're working at XYZ company, and this is the message to all listening to this podcast, if you're working there, be careful of what you say, because today could be your last day. I think that's the takeaway on this whole thing, because that
and get yourself a union.
Yeah, there you go. I'll leave it on that note. Andrew Strom, do check out the article on labor.org. onlabor.org. Can workers have free speech rights? Andrew, you take care. We'll talk to you next month. Okay, brother?
Sounds good.
And that'll be it for another edition of America's Workforce. Coming up tomorrow, the iron worker running for a seat in Congress. His story tomorrow, right here on America's Workforce. Until then, all of you have a safe and wonderful day.
That concludes another episode of the America's Workforce Radio Podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. America's Workforce is a production of Labor Tools and BMA Media Group. Find out more information online at labortools.com.